wee bit of some classic royalty-free disco music there to start this little video off. So, hello, I am Allan Faulds. I run the Ballot Scotland polling and elections website. Chances are, if you're watching this little video, that is because you are very familiar with my work already, but you never know. Perhaps you're someone who's just taking a bit of an interest in what happened in the Scottish Parliament election that took place on the 7th of May and which counted yesterday on the 8th. Yesterday, I had sort of grand plans before going into the day that perhaps I would do a couple of little live streams through the day to sort of update on how things were going and what we could learn from the results so far. As it turned out, I was incredibly busy, unsurprisingly, during the count, so I didn't really have time to do that, though I was very pleased to join the Byline Scotland live stream a couple of times before the count started and sort of later in the day, just to sort of explain where things might go and then what had actually happened over the course of the day. Also thought perhaps I would do this video as a live stream, but given that I'm kind of running on the adrenaline of the election yesterday still, I thought, probably best just to do it as a video and folk can sort of put it on and watch it later at their leisure rather than tuning in at a set time. So what I thought I would do with this little stream today is just kind of go through sort of the key headline results, what happened in yesterday's election, then perhaps drill down a little bit into the detail for each of the parties in turn. So I'm just using the results page on the Ballot Scotland website. Again, if you were sort of following me yesterday, you'll probably be very familiar with this website and the sometimes slow process of updating, but hopefully you all found it useful. So the first place to start is that we've obviously got a very, very different Parliament today compared to what we had a couple of months ago. Although the government hasn't changed, it is still going to be an SNP government. The opposition benches are radically transformed. So if we compare what we got yesterday with what happened 5 years ago, what we can see is that the SNP, Labour and the Conservatives all lost seats, whilst the Greens, Lib Dems and of course New Kids on the Block Reform gained significant numbers of seats. So we ended up with a total of 58 SNP MSPs, 17 each for Reform UK and for Labour, 15 for the Greens, 12 for the Conservatives and 10 for the Liberal Democrats. It's worth pointing out that this is the first time in the Scottish Parliament's history that not only have we had 5 parties in double-digit MSP numbers, but in fact 6 parties. Previously, the previous peak had been 4, and it was the 4 sort of classic Westminster parties early on in the Scottish Parliament's history. Now, in terms of changes versus the last election, because we had quite significant boundary changes in this election, I have followed the normal process of recalculating the results of the 2021 election for what they would have been like on the new boundaries. And by doing that, you get a better sense of what has actually changed amongst the electorate and amongst voters than if you just use the raw figures. So you may see a little difference here compared to what you might see elsewhere. So, for example, the Greens won 8 MSPs in 2021, but they would have had 10 on the new boundaries. Hence, the gain here is only 5 rather than 7. Similarly, that was effectively came at the expense of 1 seat each for the SNP and Labour. So you can effectively sort of add an additional lost seat to the SNP and Labour to get sort of the real MSP numbers. The clear sort of takeaway from yesterday is that obviously it was a very, very good day for the Greens, for the Lib Dems and for Reform UK. Pretty poor for the SNP. We'll get into why that is shortly, although they are still the government and they are clearly unchallenged for that role, and catastrophic for Labour and even more so for the Conservatives. So if we start with the SNP, the reason that this is so poor for the SNP as a party is because they spent this entire campaign talking about their prospects of winning a majority, 65 or more seats in the Scottish Parliament. They were really, really ramming home the idea that they could and that they perhaps would win a majority. I think in hindsight, and I was saying this towards the end of the campaign, I think that is going to prove to be a really bad mistake for the SNP for several reasons. Number one, the narrative that is emerging already is kind of that sense of, well, John Swinney, you set yourself the goal of a majority, you haven't achieved that, so you've had a bad result. Whereas when you consider where the SNP were 2 years ago, having lost, almost 40 MPs at Westminster to a resurgent Labour Party, actually only coming away with a net loss of 5 MSPs in this election is a phenomenal place for them to be objectively, but subjectively, they built themselves up to this idea that, they were going to get a majority. They've fallen short, so it looks pretty poor. There's also the fact that, of course, the SNP are the leading party in the pro-independence bloc. The only other party that supports independence at Holyrood are the Greens. And the SNP have kind of built up this idea that not simply is an SNP majority one of the potential mandates for a second independence referendum, but it is in fact the mandate for a second independence referendum. Now, from the perspective of the SNP wanting to maximise their representation and turn out their votes and increase their chances of winning, you can see the logic there. But if you're thinking from the perspective of a wider pro-independence camp, that may be a mistake for that camp, because if they are tying the fortunes of independence too much to one party and too much to that party getting a majority in a semi-proportional system, then that majority may never come. So perhaps a real risk there from the SNP. Nonetheless, they did have what is objectively a good result in terms of getting those 58 MSPs. That came mostly, with one exception, from winning constituencies. And there's some really interesting mixed stuff going on in the constituencies. So there are places where the SNP might have thought themselves pretty secure based on previous results. So if you look at, for example, Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch, which I'm just going to bring up there, where they've ended up, placing behind the Lib Dems, or Nahilin and Inyur, which frankly wasn't on my radar. Perhaps it should have been, given the issue of ferries being a really motivating one locally. But they had a couple of surprise constituency losses. They also had, if I zoom in a little bit here, they also had some losses in the Central Belt, Glasgow South Side and Edinburgh Central to the Greens. Those were, I think, big shocks to the party. Also, Edinburgh Northern to the Lib Dems. So, some places where the SNP were clearly going backwards. On the other hand, Shetland. Shetland has been Lib Dem since effectively the dawn of time, but this is the election despite the fact the SNP went massively backwards and the Lib Dems had a massive improvement. This is the election where the SNP have won Shetland. Now, again, like Nahilin and Yer, this really comes down to local issues. A sense that the Lib Dems had picked a poor candidate locally and the SNP had picked a good candidate, and that was borne out by the result on the day. Just as a little aside, if we go down and look at the results of the regional vote by constituency, note how the Lib Dems are still ahead on that, or rather they flipped because the SNP were ahead in Shetland on the list vote last time around. So that shows the sort of real complexity of the kind of how people are voting differently on the two different ballots. Likewise, if you go down to Strathkelvin and Bearsden, where the Lib Dems beat them in the constituency, the SNP very narrowly ahead. So overall, a good day for the SNP in terms of the number of constituencies, but a really big stumble in terms of getting that majority. We can also see, if we go down to that list vote, that the real story of the election for the SNP is how badly their vote cratered. If we go to, for example, Glasgow, less than 30%, they were over 40% last time. You go and look at the North East, 28.6%. This is a place where, in 2011, in their famous majority back then, they got not just all 10 constituencies, but an additional list MSP. This time around, the only list MSP they got was Highlands and Islands, where because they had lost Caithness and Sutherland and Ross and Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch to the Lib Dems, they did pick up one seat there, meaning that Marie Todd, who's been a long-serving minister in the Scottish Government, retained her seat. If we then move on to the second place party, and I'm going to talk about Reform as second place party rather than Labour, even though both parties have, as we see up here, the same number of seats. Because if we go down and have a look at the regional list vote, you can see that Reform are ahead oh so marginally, 16.6% compared to 16% for Labour. But the thing is, the Scottish Parliament is a partly proportionally elected chamber, and therefore we should be looking at that proportional vote as the sort of the primary measure of how much support each party has. So Reform in second by that measure, but crucially, regardless of how you measure it, not the official opposition. There's no such thing in the Scottish Parliament. It doesn't really make sense in a proportional parliament to have an official opposition like at Westminster, where they would have the lion's share of the speaking time. Instead, they will have exactly as much speaking time, exactly as many committee conveners as Labour will, and presumably, my assumption is that First Minister's questions will probably alternate. You will have one party go first one week, you'll have the other party go first the next week, and swap about consistently through the term. Now, Reform placing second is obviously incredible from the perspective of Scotland never having had a sort of a far right party in Parliament at any time in its history. And, even when, for example, UKIP were doing very, very well in England, in Scotland, they just were not registering at all. Something like, 2% of the vote in 2015 in Scotland for the UK Parliament, when they were about 15% in England. But Reform have broken through in a really big way, improving on what was already a pretty good result for them by historic standards in the UK Parliament election in 2024. But despite the fact they are now the second party, in vote terms at least, they are the weakest second party in Holyrood's history. Previously, that record was held by the SNP themselves when they won only 27 MSPs after the 2003 election. Funnily enough, that was during John Swinney's first term as leader of the SNP. So this is 10 seats fewer than the previous weakest primary opposition party. So you are really, really weakened opposition compared to what we have had in the past. And also, if we go back up to the constituency results, it's the first time that the largest opposition party didn't win any constituencies. Now, they came very, very close in Banffshire and Buchan Coast. You can see just a 1.2% majority for the SNP's Karen Adam. That was their best shot anywhere in the country in gaining a constituency, and they didn't get it. One thing I want to perhaps be a little bit smug about is that was the only seat that I, on Ballot Box Scotland, thought was really in contention for them to actually gain by the end of the campaign. I did also kind of have Galloway and West Dumfries on the radar, and I will put my hand up and say, clearly, I was miles off there because they were absolutely nowhere near to getting it. But if you looked at, for example, some of the MRPs or some of the other sort of projections, you were getting the idea that perhaps they could win these other Aberdeenshire seats. And again, they've got good shares in Aberdeenshire East, but not enough to win. Similarly, some of the MRPs were doing things like saying, they would get Airdrie, miles behind in Airdrie. I think Cunningham South came up as one prospect, miles behind. Ayr, nowhere near getting it. Carrickcumlock and Doon Valley, second place, but pretty far behind. So the expectation from other sources that they might have got some constituency seats was completely overblown. Where they have instead had great success is, of course, that regional list vote. So if we go down to my little handy table of where they got MSPs, what you can tell by this is in, for example, Central and Lothians West, they got more votes than Labour. That's why they've got, 3 MSPs there, and Labour only have 2. Indeed, they got more votes than Labour in many of the regions across the country, in Highlands and Islands, in the North East, in Mid-Scotland, in Fife, in South. So, really, really, a really, really strong showing for Reform, but their vote has ended up kind of well spread, and that was the big question: where would Reform's votes come from? And I kind of thought that it would be largely the Northeast and Central Belt, particularly this Central Scotland, Lothians West, this wedge of constituencies in between Scotland's 2 big cities. And do you know what? Those are indeed their top 2 regions. And I have to say, perhaps surprisingly, it is that Central Belt one that is slightly higher, 20.6%, compared to North East Scotland with 19.4%. So a really sort of solid, even result for Reform across the country. But where you see real outliers are, number one, in Glasgow, again, sort of a little bit lower, but also in Edinburgh and Lothians East, just 10.4% there. Only one MSP. It's the only region where they've only got a single MSP. If we then move on to sort of their counterparts, Labour, who have also won 17 MSPs, there's a very large degree to which I do not understand what Labour were doing with the last stage of the campaign. Again, if we look at sort of the both votes here, if we look at the constituency vote, lost 2.4%. If we go down to the regional vote, lost 1.6%. Now, not as bad a loss in the regional vote, but again, it's a proportionally elected parliament. You need to hold as many of those votes and increase those votes as possible to gain. But what we saw was, even at a time when every other party was, shouting and screaming, "Vote for us on the peach ballot. You have to use your peach vote for us." The Conservatives were outright, frankly, lying and claiming that a vote for them in the regional ballot had previously stopped SNP majorities when it had done no such thing. But everyone else is going, "You've got to vote for us," or in the case of SNP, "You've got to do both votes SNP." And Labour almost spent like the past few weeks of the campaign, when polling was showing they just weren't making any headway whatsoever, kind of going like, "Well, actually, our promise rates from canvassing are really good. So I think we're going to do better than that," rather than running a campaign focused and making sure they got those proportional votes. And what we have seen is that was an absolute catastrophe for Labour. They gained one constituency compared to 2021. Yep, they got Nahill in a year. As I said, that is very likely due to local issues. The ferry situation there has been absolutely dire. My own mum wasn't able to vote in this election, partly because ahead of the deadline for postal votes, she ended up stranded in Harris for a few extra days, and her postal vote form was very much not on the Isle of Harris. So there's a real understanding of why they got that there, but they didn't make any other headway. They didn't gain any of the other seats. East Lothian Coast and Lammermuir's the easiest seat for them to gain from the SNP in the entire country. 1.2% behind, very close, but they didn't get it. What about Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse? That constituency they won at last year's by-election, miles behind. 8.7% majority for the SNP there. Rutherglen and Campus Lang, their best shot in Glasgow, like something like their third or fourth most winnable seat in the whole of Scotland after the ones they hold. 17.2% behind. Clydebank and Milngavie, another highly winnable seat, 13.3% behind. Uddingston and Bellshill, 12.4% behind. They claimed they were running this incredible constituency vote strategy, and it has completely fallen down. Perhaps because they were trying too hard to win too many votes in too many constituencies rather than focusing on a select few. The two constituencies that they did hold, they held the Dumbarton constituency, funnily enough, the constituency I was born and grew up in. I did enjoy shortly before the election someone replying to Ballot Box Scotland when I put up a projection that she would hold her seat, with Jackie Baillie could survive a direct hit on Faz Lane, which is of course the nuclear base which is in her constituency. And they also held Edinburgh Southern. And again, I'm going to be really sort of, I suppose smug is the term here. I'm going to be really smug about Edinburgh Southern because if you look at other sources, like for example the BBC, that will say that is a Labour gain from the SNP on the basis of the new boundaries in 2021. My own calculations do not have that as an SNP seat in 2021. They have it as a Labour seat, closer than the previous version of Edinburgh Southern, but still a Labour seat. And I think that the fact that Labour have held on to this when they have not made any other gains elsewhere in their sort of their central belt constituencies they wanted, I think that speaks to my call and my notional estimate being the one that is correct, rather than the one that thinks this was an SNP seat previously. If we now move on to the Greens now, over the past decade, everyone has gotten used to talking about the Greens as the fourth party in the Scottish Parliament, and they are again the fourth party in the Scottish Parliament. But they have never before been the fourth party in the Scottish Parliament ahead of the Conservatives. Now, this is the point at which I would begin to say we are talking about parties that had a really good election result that you could describe as one of the winners of the election. Everyone else so far has some kind of caveat where you go, well, that's maybe good, but it's not as good as it could have been. So the SNP, they didn't get their majority. For Reform, sure, they're in second place, but they wanted to be properly in second place, not a shared second place with Labour. Labour obviously haven't had a good election. You couldn't describe them as winners at all. They have had a dire time of it. But the Greens actually have serious, meaningful gains that are in line with what they wanted to achieve. So 15 MSPs is a doubling of the raw numbers of MSPs they've actually elected. And not only that, but as part of that, they gained two constituencies. And again, here is where things get a little bit smug on my part. Edinburgh Central was the big one. I had that marked out from very, very early on, from the moment I saw the new boundary for that constituency as a potential Green gain, replacing the previous Glasgow Kelvin, which was split so many ways. I didn't think that that was in serious contention. Now, I spent the campaign hedging my bets and saying, look, I'm not sure the Greens have the ground campaign necessary to do this, but there were a couple of other sources, one source in particular, who was very scathing about my suggestion that based on prior performance on the list vote in this area and the fact that the Greens won the most votes in the council election in 2022 in this area, they could win this constituency. Also feeling vindicated in terms of Angus Robertson, who was the SNP MSP for this constituency, ran one of the most dishonest campaigns I've ever seen in my life. On the day of the election, he had an A board outside polling stations pointing to Labour and the Greens, saying they can't beat reform here. The whole campaign, because the previous version of Edinburgh Central, which is very different to this one, it had more of the territory in the north that you can see on this map is now orange, because it had that territory was a marginal with the Conservatives. He spent the whole campaign pretending that it was a two-horse race with the Conservatives, as if the Conservative horse hadn't already been taken out back and shot by the Conservatives' collapse in support, never mind the boundary changes. And here we have a stonking win for the Greens in their first ever constituency, massive. And not only did the Greens and Labour beat Reform and the Conservatives, despite what Angus Robertson's A board said, they both beat Angus Robertson. So I think a real, quite frankly, comeuppance for Angus Robertson there. But the other one, and again, this is a really interesting one, is Glasgow South Side. At the last day of the campaign, and we'll get onto the vote in a second, the last day of the campaign, the Ballot Box Scotland model, based on some good polls for the Greens, tipped Southside to the Greens' favour by less than 1 percentage point. Now, they ended up winning it by nearly 8%. So much like buses, you wait ages for one and then two turn up, two Green constituencies when they'd never before had a single constituency. And these have come about, from incredibly hard campaigning on the ground from Greens, obviously, but also from the fact that their support increased so massively. So you'll forgive me, so this chart is slightly off just because of the nature of missing data. You'll see these grey bits here. I might talk about those shortly. But the Greens' final result, the top line here is correct. It's only the 2022, 2021 that's slightly off. The Greens' top line vote is 14% on the regional list vote. Now, the Greens have a long history of underperforming against their polling average, usually by about 1 or 2%. This is bang on. The very last polling average that I had on Ballot Box Scotland had the Greens on exactly 14%, and that's exactly what they've got. And what's interesting is if you go back to the 2022 council elections, the Greens overperformed. They did better than expected, winning councillors in, for example, both the Lanarkshires, which I had written off as possibilities in that election. In 2024, modest though the results were, they also did very well by Westminster standards in Scotland. So they've perhaps come to the end of that tendency of underperforming against polling. And we can actually see, if we look at individual constituency level, we can see some really sort of interesting bits and pieces. So we go up to the North East, some of you wouldn't think of them as strong. Second on the list vote in Aberdeen Central. The same is true in Stirling. They may have only won 2 constituencies, but in 5 of them, they were the largest party by regional list vote. So Edinburgh, Northern and Leith, massive lead over the SNP there. Again, pretty decent lead over the SNP in Kelvin and Maryhill, and over the SNP in Glasgow Central. That really matters. Because first of all, we've already seen by Edinburgh Central and by Glasgow South Side that strong performance on the list at previous elections can be turned into constituency wins. If people are made aware of the fact that the Greens actually won the most votes in those constituencies and one of the votes, people may be willing to vote for the Greens in those constituencies at the next election, because they will no longer feel the Greens can't win. So a really strong result for the Greens, and that resulted in massive gains of list MSPs. So in Edinburgh and Lothians East, where they already had a constituency, 3 further MSPs for a total of 4 on the list. In Glasgow, 2 extra MSPs on the list for a total of 3. They also got 2 MSPs in each of Highlands and Islands and West, and they were so close. They were so close to a second MSP in Mid-Scotland and Fife, 0.3% behind the Conservatives. And if they'd beaten the Conservatives, they would have got a second MSP there. This is where the effect of independent Green Voice, a fake party led by a guy who was expelled from UKIP in like the noughties for Holocaust denial, comes in. It's not a real party. It has confused voters. Independent Green Voice got 0.87% in Mid Scotland in fact. If even just over a third of those voters were voters who were confused by the logo, and we know we've heard it from so many people that was the case, the Greens would have won this seat. In 2021, Independent Green Voice cost the Greens 2 seats. Something has to be done about this. Whether or not you like the Greens, this is democratically unacceptable. You cannot be allowing one party alone to be targeted in this way and to have had each time 3 women candidates blocked. That's just, it should be, regardless of your opinions on the party, that should be recognised and seen as democratically unacceptable. Also really interesting, we talk about the fact that the SNP won a huge number of constituencies. That has thrown the proportionality off, and this has affected other parties as well. But if you look, for example, at Central Scotland and Lothians West, that is enough votes to get 2 MSPs. 12.2% should get you 2 MSPs, but just because the SNP won 9 constituencies, there wasn't the space on the list for that to be the case. So a very, very good result for the Greens. If we then do a massive volte-face and turn around to the party that have had the absolute worst result, the Conservatives, from 31 seats, the largest opposition party, down to just 12. Their previous low was 15. This is a disaster for the Conservatives. Could not be more disastrous. Now, they did have some very small bright spots. So one that I didn't touch on for the SNP was the SNP gained Eastwood from the Conservatives. Now, you might ask, hang on a minute, how's that a bright spot? And the reason it's a bright spot is because they would only have been proportionally due 1 MSP in the West Scotland region. If it had been this constituency that they got, their leader, Russell Finlay, would have lost his seat. So not only would the Conservatives be sat there with their worst ever result in history, they would also have been the first major party to have lost their leader at a Holyrood election. So what is already a bad election for the Conservatives could have been worse. But that said, that was the only one of the constituencies they lost. Aberdeenshire West, they held on to quite handily. Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire, I never expected was really in much contention. Dumfriesshire, they held on to. Galloway and West Dumfries, perhaps surprisingly, they held on to Galloway and West Dumfries more easily than they did Dumfriesshire. Galloway and West Dumfries are the equivalent seat. They actually won that at both the Scottish Parliament in 1999 and the UK Parliament in 1997. So they have a history there that predates their surge era. But once you get beyond those areas, there was no prospect whatsoever, really, of Conservative gains. If you look at Ayr, which was highly marginal before, they're miles behind now in Ayr. Aberdeenshire East, they ran it relatively close, but not enough to get within a chance of winning. The Perthshires, massively behind the SNP in those areas. One that is kind of worth noting is that they actually came very close to beating Stephen Flynn in Aberdeen, Deeside and North Kincardine. So what we're looking at for the Conservatives then is, well, what happened on the list? And this is where things get really bad. So their list vote share, their correct vote share in 2021 is 23.5, goes down to 11.8, so a really big loss. But at one region in particular I want to point at, Glasgow, 4.3%. Absolutely disastrous for them there. That means losing representation in Glasgow for the first time. Look at those Glasgow MSPs, not a Conservative amongst them. They've still got representation in every other region, but completely locked out of Glasgow. It's the first time they haven't been a nationwide party at an election, but it's the first time the Greens have been a nationwide party. And you can see why it was so bad for them if you look at some of the regional breakdowns. Highlands and Islands, 10.1%, narrowly beaten by the Greens for that last seat. But also, they had 4 MSPs in this region last time. Now they have 1. Central Scotland and Lothians West, they had 3 last time. Now they have 1. West Scotland, they had 4 last time. Now they have 1. Edinburgh and Lothians East, they had 3 last time. You guessed it, now they have 1. Really, really bad for the Conservatives. Last, but by no means least, another one of the big winners of this election, the Lib Dems. So they gained 6 seats in total to get up to 10, and a large part of that came from some really good constituency wins. Yes, they lost Shetland, we discussed that earlier, But Caithness, Sutherland, and Ross, I had that earmarked as an obvious gain from the SNP for the whole campaign. They pulled that off very easily. They did very well to gain Skylar Cabernet. I think they might not have had Kate Forbes not chosen to stand down. I think Kate Forbes probably has enough of a personal vote, which is a rarity, as we're about to get onto, which is a rarity amongst MSPs that she would have held it for the SNP, but a very good result there. Inverness and Nairn, they came very, very close, in part because of the presence of Fergus Ewing. And this is what we're actually have to kind of point at the Lib Dems, because I'd heard on the grapevine from the Lib Dems that they really weren't picking up very much support for Fergus Ewing in the constituency. But actually, that other share is almost entirely Fergus Ewing. He got about 21% of the vote. Former SNP MSP Fergus Ewing, he fell out with the party during this term. Very close to winning it, but not quite. But also two really important central belt gains. Number one, Edinburgh Northern. This is kind of similar to Edinburgh Central in that it is one that I expected or could have easily believed that based on their performance at council level that the Lib Dems could take this, and they absolutely did. And then Strathkelvin and Bearsden is one that actually a little bit surprised. It was on my radar. I had my final projection. I said, look, this is one that could go to the Lib Dems, but I thought because it's really only Strathkelvin and Bearsden South, and the remainder of Bearsden is in Clydebank and Milngavie, and Milngavie is in Clydebank and Milngavie, that this would be too different to their Mid Dunbartonshire constituency they have at Westminster for them to win the seat, but they pulled it off. Really, really good result. So really strong results for the Lib Dems in some key constituencies. But beyond that, also some really good regional results. So if we go again down here, we can see there are 3 regional MSPs for the Lib Dems. One in South, one in the Northeast, one in Highlands and Islands. Northeast and South are interesting because they held both of those in 2016 when they had their big collapse from 16 to 5 MSPs. They lost South in 2016 and they lost the Northeast in 2021. So they have regained both of these with pretty sort of decent vote shares. South 5.6%. Given the Conservatives held all the border constituencies, that was enough there. 8.4%. If I scroll up a little bit, 8.4% in the Northeast. Also very, very good for the Lib Dems. The really interesting one is that Highlands and Islands list MSP, and that is because their vote share 23.6%, really, really strong Lib Dem vote share in the Highlands and Islands, so justified them getting an additional MSP. If they hadn't done that, if they had won Inverness and Nairn, they wouldn't have got this list MSP, and the SNP would have got that instead. So a good result for the Lib Dems. Them and Reform probably have the 2 biggest question marks over their number of MSPs in this term. And that's because for the Lib Dems, if we actually go to the constituency level, their most successful MSP in this election was Liam MacArthur, the MSP for Orkney Islands. Liam MacArthur has I think someone described it as a North Korea level majority. But Liam MacArthur is also someone who is very, very well liked, very well respected at Holyrood, and has been one of the deputy presiding officers of the previous term of Parliament. And I think the general consensus is that Liam MacArthur probably becomes the presiding officer in this term of the Parliament. And if that is the case, obviously that means the Lib Dems drop down to 9 MSPs because the presiding officer gives up their party affiliation. So that's kind of a run through of all the parties. And I said I would talk about the Reform also potentially having a question mark over their number of MSPs. No Nigel Farage-led party has lasted very long in any Parliament without having some kind of massive fallout, having to expel someone because it turns out they've elected someone a lot more extreme than they anticipated, and a couple of times in the European Parliament, actually, those people have been jailed for quite serious crimes. I am not suggesting that any of Reform's newly elected MSPs are going to be jailed for serious crimes the way those former UKIP MEPs were, but I am suggesting there is a very good chance that come Christmas, Reform will not have the number of MSPs they have today. And if that is the case, then if we go back to our earlier sort of conversation around the idea of who gets to go first at First Minister's questions and assuming it rotates, Labour then get to go first at First Minister's questions if that happens. So that I think is probably like a decent enough rundown of what we experienced yesterday. Um, there's probably a few other little bits that it is worth sort of maybe picking up and thinking about if we look at the regional results, just to sort of cap off that, just to sort of show how things have shifted. So if we think about the kind of spread of each party's vote across the country, Labour have consistently been either first or second across most of the central belt. So West Scotland, Glasgow, Central Scotland and Lothians West, Edinburgh and Lothians East, or their predecessors, which were Central Scotland and Lothian regions. Um, this election, how bad this election is for Labour is shown by the fact that that is no longer the case in three of those four. Edinburgh and Lothians East, they're behind the Greens. Glasgow, they're behind the Greens. Central Scotland and Lothians West, they're behind Reform, albeit just the tiniest bit. Only in the west of Scotland did they remain in second place. That is a really, really like shocking turn of events to imagine. To imagine the Labour Party coming third in Glasgow, a party whose votes used to have to be counted, not weighed, in this city, now in third place. The Greens also have never before now beaten either of Labour or the Conservatives in any regional vote, and yet they've done so. Obviously, I've explained the ones where the central belt where they've beaten both parties across across a couple of them. But Highlands and Islands beat both parties. The North East beat Labour. Mid Scotland and Fife so close to beating um, the Conservatives at least. So really, really sort of strong results, like with the Greens really moving up the pack and overtaking longer established parties. And that really matters if you think about the fact that we have council elections next year, and that unlike England, which had a bunch of council elections today, and you were seeing things like entire councils with like 55 councillors going like 53 to Reform and 47 to the Lib Dems and stuff like that, because they're not proportionally elected. In Scotland, they are proportionally elected. So we're going to see a lot of Reform councillors next year, and a good way to gauge how many that might be would be to go to the regional vote map here and have a little look and see. But we're also going to see potentially lots of gains for example, the Lib Dems in Edinburgh, in the Highlands, potentially across Fife where they had some decent results. We might see, in fact, we will see significant losses for the Conservatives, even where the Conservatives have previously done quite well. Places like Clydesdale, Midlothian, South Tweedale, and Lauderdale, the Perthshires, potentially on track to lose quite a few councillors there. We would expect to see the same in other areas. So, for example, Glasgow, if the Greens have just beaten Labour for Holyrood, they might fancy their chances of doing so at council level. Can you imagine a Glasgow City Council in which Labour are in third place? Like, absolutely unthinkable until just a couple of days ago. The SNP also they held on to so many seats because of the disproportionality of the first past the post voting system for the constituency vote. They will not have that defence for council elections. So if you imagine somewhere where Bathgate's I've got up there's probably not a great example, but if you imagine somewhere like East Lothian Coast and Lammermuirs, the kind of vote distributions there, if those were replicated in individual wards, as if it was a 4-member ward, you're going to get the SNP, Labour, Greens, and the Conservatives or Reform. That's what you're going to get in that ward. You're not going to have the space for the SNP to get two councillors. You're not going to have if the SNP are getting 25% in Glasgow areas, they're not going to get two councillors. So there's a real possibility that both Labour and the SNP could really, really lose a lot of seats next year just because their votes have have reduced so much in these kind of key areas. I said one final note to finish on, and this is a little bit of a downer, but notice these grey patches. This has been like a real bugbear of mine for past elections, that we do not properly report on the regional result by constituency, even though that is vitally important information. Like the BBC, you will never see this information on the BBC. You will have to go somewhere like Ballot Scotland to get it. Look at some of what we talked about earlier. The SNP won Shetland, but the Lib Dems were actually the most popular party on the list. The SNP won Banffshire and Buchan Coast, but Reform were the most popular party on the list. The SNP won East Lothian Coast and Lammermuirs, but Labour were ahead. They won Eastwood, but the Conservatives were ahead. They won Glasgow Central, Glasgow and Glasgow North Eastern and Leith. but the Greens were ahead. These kind of show us almost the reality of, what are voters actually think when they are not constrained by the tactical voting constraints of first past the post. This is really, really useful information to have. It tells us the story of what happened much more in a much more granular way than just looking at, oh, here's how many votes there were in the northeast Scotland region. It tells us, we can see that the Greens, who got about like nearly 10% across the whole region, didn't register in Banffshire and Buchan Coast. Pretty poor results in Aberdeenshire East. Aberdeen Donside, barely there at all. But then, once you get into Aberdeen Central, really, really big. Likewise, when you're looking at the story of, well, how did the Lib Dems regain an MSP in the south of Scotland? You're going to be looking at Midlothian, South Tweedale and Lauderdale. You're going to be looking at Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire. You're not going to be looking at Carrick, Cumnock and Doon Valley. It's really, really important and useful to have this information. So why, first of all, do the broadcasters not publish it on their websites the way that, for example, New Zealand do? They've got an almost identical voting system. They'll have an election later this year. I regularly follow New Zealand elections. And if you go on to like a newspaper or a broadcaster, it has both votes for every constituency updated in real time, rather than just pretending that we only have the constituency vote. But even with the count having concluded yesterday, I have 9 constituencies, the Angus constituencies, the Falkirk constituencies, and the North Lanarkshire constituencies, where I do not have this data. So I can't actually tell you for sure what really happened in this Central Scotland and Lothians West region, particularly how the Greens got their big increase, because these two West Lothian constituencies are not particularly remarkable. There must be something good in Cumbernauld and Kilsyth and the Falkirks. I don't know, because we don't have this information. We don't know what actually happened in Angus and the Angus constituencies, because this information has not been published by those councils. And they're not the only ones. The last I checked, the Borders hadn't published this information. I have the Borders constituencies because a party activist sent them to me. I think there's a few other councils in the same case. I think this is unacceptable. I think this is unacceptable to have an electoral system with 2 votes and to just ignore one of those votes, to pretend that one of those votes, it doesn't matter except in the aggregate, except in the total of what was won across the whole region. Yes, that's what matters for the seat distribution, but it is these local results that tell us that what is happening across Scotland, and they are essential to understanding the election. If the only thing you know about the Greens, and I'm talking about the Greens because they are the party that mostly only stand on the list vote, if you only have the overall regional result in a given region, you don't know what happened with the Greens in that election, and that is a massive, massive gap. So I've written to the Electoral Management Board for Scotland, kind of sort of, I suppose, complain a little and be like, look, I don't think this is good enough, and I really hope that is something that we improve in the next election in 2031. So hopefully that's been an interesting and a kind of like useful rundown of what happened. I appreciate it's kind of like it'll be like 45 minutes of like Ballot Box Scotland's stream of consciousness. But hey, people maybe like that kind of thing. Also, just at this final point, really worth pointing out that if you enjoy Ballot Box Scotland's work, if you enjoy my output, you think that this kind of stuff is useful, please do donate. There's a wee, just below me there-ish, a little bit that tells you where you can go to donate. A few quid is always very welcome. I do this entirely on a voluntary basis. I don't get paid for it, except occasionally, if I'm on Scotland Tonight, they pay their guests an appearance fee. But this isn't my job. I do this for the love of the game, almost. Also, remember to check out the Ballot Box Scotland website. You'll find the full results, all these charts that I've been sort of scrolling up and down between in a probably slightly awkward way on the website there. And over the coming days, I will also be publishing a whole bunch more analysis of what happened, what were the swings in different areas once I have all these regional results. What kind of things might have happened differently if, for example, we had a slightly fairer voting system, something I like to talk about a lot. How affected were other parties by the fact the SNP have probably won something like 20 seats more than they proportionally should have? Like, how did that impact the other parties? And more analysis than you could think you could possibly have needed to know, but you'll find it all on Ballot Box Scotland.